mind.
I just looked at the phone. Afternoon. It is 1:30.
Did you take care of your condo selling problem?
Not over the weekend.
Why not? Realtors are mostly work on weekends.
Not mine.
For you.
Oh.
Do you want me to give you a signal when you have 15 minutes left?
Sure.
Okay. What should the signal be?
I don't know. Just shout. You have 15 minutes left.
Okay. All right. So if everybody doesn't know me, I think most of you do at this point. My name's Kim Teachout, and I play viola with the Traverse Symphony Orchestra. And we're going to talk about 3 composers today that we will be performing next weekend. The first one is Michael Doherty. Doherty is a name that you may not have heard of. He is still living. He was born in 1954, so he's one of these people who is a very, very fine composer, but hasn't really become famous yet because he's still alive. Right?
Well, we can do something about that.
Yeah.
We're going to comment on that.
So, the piece that we're going to be performing by Michael Doherty is called Sunset Strip. And it is about the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles, if any of you have been there. It was written in 1999, and it originally was premiered by the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra in the year 2000. The work was, of course, inspired by the iconic Sunset Strip, which is a 1.5 mile long section of Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. After the premiere of the Sunset Strip by the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, Ivan Hewitt of the Daily Telegraph named Doherty as the orchestral chronicler of American culture and described the piece, in addition to Doherty's Route 66, as winning and affectionate. Hewitt added, in works such as Route 66 and Sunset Strip, he paints the hopes and dreams embodied in interstate highways, wide open spaces, and all-night bars where Frank Sinatra crooned. Other critics said of his work, another nostalgia-tinged work, tunefully bouncy in its outer movements, whimsically titled 7 p.m. and 7 a.m., and warm in its central nocturne. So it has 3 movements. The first movement is 7 p.m., the middle movement is called nocturne, and the last movement is 7 a.m. I would have expected the a.m. and p.m. to be reversed, that the a.m. would have come first and the p.m. second, but
No,
not in this case.
It's how you feel after a whole night of...
Okay.
I assume his Route 66 was not the song Get Your Kicks on Route 66.
No, it was not. No.
Is he out of Ann Arbor?
No, I actually don't know where he's out of. I think he's maybe out of Kansas, actually, from what I remember reading about him.
You know,
Yeah.
he sounded familiar to somebody out of Ann Arbor.
Okay, I'm going to check with that while we're listening to Matthew when we get to it. I can look it up in my, as my dad calls it, my magic box. My phone. So the nice thing about playing a piece by a composer who's still living is that he actually made comments and provided, what are they called at the beginning of the program? Just a synopsis of his work for, preface for that we could read his own words about what he wrote, which I thought is actually something that usually when we're researching Beethoven or Mozart or Shostakovich or any other composer, we have to dig deep sometimes into these old books and everything to find quotes from the actual composer. So I'm going to read a little bit of what Michael said about his Sunset Strip. Beginning in downtown Los Angeles, Sunset Boulevard passes through glamorous neighborhoods such as Beverly Hills and Bel Air and ends at the Pacific Ocean. The 1.5 mile stretch of Sunset Boulevard, passing through West Hollywood, is the legendary Sunset Strip. Beginning in the 1930s, Sunset Strip was popular with the Hollywood jet set for its glamorous restaurants and nightclubs. By the 1960s, the rock club Whiskey A Go Go became a major gathering place for the hippie counterculture on Sunset Strip. It even inspired 77 Sunset Strip, a popular television series in the 60s about private detectives, and a significant book of photography by pop artist Edward Ruscha, entitled Every Building on the Sunset Strip. That's from 1966. He also stated, in my orchestral composition, I create a musical landscape where I reimagine the various sounds and images of Sunset Strip, past and present, from sundown through the midnight hour until sunrise. My dreamlike musical journey takes us past swank restaurants, beatnik hangouts, dazzling hotels, Rat Pack nightclubs, private eye offices, rock clubs with go-go dancers, Mexican restaurants, and smoky jazz lounges. In Sunset Strip, I place the listener in the driver's seat and create music in motion where anything can happen, and it usually does. From my own personal experience of this piece, I don't have a lot other than just practicing it and also listening to it. Finding a recording was a bit of a challenge. I couldn't just YouTube it. I actually found it on his personal website, but just a snippet of it, not the entire thing. And then there was a recording done, I believe in 2011, that's on Spotify, which is another music sharing website. But I had to become a member and all this official stuff to be able to access it. So when I first listened to it, I thought that it does exactly what Michael tells us that it's supposed to do. It's supposed to create nostalgia. It's supposed to make us think of jazz clubs and swanky restaurants and kind of the big, bright lights, big city of a night out on the town. It made me think of, when I was in my 20s, I used to go and visit my sister in Chicago, and we would get all dressed up, and we'd go out to the Green Mill, which is a jazz club that Al Capone used to go to, and it's kind of this swankiness. And it also reminded me of a family vacation that I took when I was a kid, and riding in the backseat of my parents' car as we were in LA, and we were driving down Sunset Strip and all the big bright lights and everything. It was starting to be in the evening time, and people were out and about, and it was just really busy. And that's what it is. It's busy, it's interrupting, it's kind of like there'll be some sort of percussive effect that takes hold, and it's like, oh, that must be a car honking or something. It makes you feel like you're being cut off at every turn. And it brings us back to kind of this nostalgic, you're in an episode of Dragnet, or or if anybody has watched the recent show Mad Men, which is based in the 60s. And also, it might bring you back to an episode of Hawaii Five-0. And the reason I say that, I'm going to actually play the beginning of Sunset Strip, which is the 7 p.m. movement, and the theme is taken directly from the theme song of Hawaii Five-0. So that will be the last thing to listen to, and then we'll get to Beethoven and Mozart, or Shostakovich.
Kim?
Yeah.
Would you think that this is a modern thing, but that reminds you of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue of the 30s, and
Absolutely.
where he was trying to do the same.
Yes, I think that there's definitely remnants of that too.
I don't know is that in music, but I meant the idea.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea is there. So here's Hawaii Five-0. That's all we needed that. And then here's Doherty's 7 p.m. movement. And then, of course, it's going away from the Hawaii Five-0 theme at this point.
actually took it from Hawaii 5-0.
It really sounds like it to me.
It absolutely.
But I could not find anything that he wrote about the piece that he had taken themes from other places.
You know who happened to write the music for 5-0?
No, I don't know that either.
Because that's I forgot how great it was.
Yeah, I know, right?
Very
It's a pretty awesome theme song.
He wasn't the composer on Hawaii 5-0?
No, I don't think he would. He would have only been 10 years old.
Right.
Oh.
Okay.
Or actually 6,
He could have been Mozart.
Who knows? So, yeah, it's not unusual for composers to take themes from other sources and use them in their works and change them around a little bit. So I just thought that was really interesting. It actually wasn't even me that figured it out. I put this on this morning, and I knew I recognized it even from when I started. Well, I didn't actually. When I was practicing it, I didn't recognize it because we don't have the theme. My part doesn't have the theme. That's the trumpet theme. But when I did listen to it, I thought, gosh, that sounds really familiar, and I couldn't place it. And this morning, I was just, what am I going to play for the example? Pressing on the computer buttons, and Matthew's in the kitchen making his coffee, and he goes, "Is that Hawaii 5-0?" And I was like, "Oh, wow! I think I need to include that in my little speech." So, all right, let's get on to Beethoven and Shostakovich.
Beethoven and Shostakovich. So, there we go. Okay, so Beethoven and Shostakovich, or BS for short. Couldn't resist, sorry.
What's he trying to tell?
Beethoven and Shostakovich. Oh, you got the joke right. Okay.
He's a BS.
So, actually, to be honest, I was not really very familiar with Shostakovich at all before I started doing a little bit of research for the lecture. He's never been a composer that I really paid a whole lot of attention to. I've listened to a handful of his works, but I didn't really know much about his life or career. And as I started reading it, I was struck by how vivid so many of the parallels are between the life and career of Shostakovich and the life and career of Beethoven. These two composers actually have an extraordinary amount in common. Their careers seem to be kind of symmetrically shaped by a lot of the political forces that they were having to contend with. Both of them began their careers right in the middle of really earth-shaking political revolutions. Beethoven's career begins in the middle of the French Revolution in the 1790s, which, to my way of thinking, is probably the most significant historical event of the last 500 years. I mean, it's really, so much has come out of that revolution. Shostakovich, of course, begins his career as the Russian Revolution is taking shape. And this is a really fateful thing for them because they end up spending the rest of their career in many ways struggling against the political circumstances laid down by those revolutionary activities. But at the same time, both of them, I think, are revolutionaries of their own kind. In many respects, Beethoven was very deeply sympathetic to the French Revolution. You probably are already aware that he dedicated his Third Symphony to Napoleon Bonaparte. In fact, the original title of the symphony was the Bonaparte Symphony. He withdrew that dedication when he heard that Napoleon had declared himself emperor. He began to feel that he had placed a very, very misguided confidence in this figure. We'll talk about that a little bit later then. So in order to kind of talk about both of them, I'm going to try and, in many respects, kind of present them as a single story. And I'm going to kind of stop in the middle and switch from Beethoven's career over to Shostakovich's because they take the same shape. And in some ways you can almost tell the same story about these two men. That's what I'm going to try to do. So here, my first slide, this is a portrait of Beethoven. This portrait was made in the year 1803, about a year after he completed his second symphony.
Can we dim the lights just a little bit?
Can we dim? Oh yeah, actually, let's see if we can get rid of those lights shining on the screen here.
Yeah, well, he was living.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's
Yeah. Yeah. You see, oh yeah, he's even better looking, isn't he? He was kind of as monstrous as his personality is sometimes presented. He really was a very good-looking man, better looking than most composers, I think. But at any rate, so this is what he looked like about the time that he composed the Second Symphony. And the Second Symphony is the last of 7 works that were dedicated to one of Beethoven's early patrons, Prince Lichnowsky. And my very favorite story about Beethoven directly concerns Prince Lichnowsky, whom I'll talk about in a little bit. But first, why don't we hear a little snippet of the symphony that we're going to be hearing at the next program. Let me see if I can get to it here. So this is Symphony number 2, and I'm going to have us listen to about the last 3 minutes. And this particular performance is being conducted by Daniel Barenboim. Some of you are probably familiar with his work. I'd like you to actually pay close attention to what Barenboim is up to, because his bodily movements at the end of this symphony, I think, are sort of exemplary of the symphony's character as a whole. And in fact, the entire orchestra seems to be unusually lively in these last moments. Watch what's going on physically with the players and the conductor here. Oops. And that's not the screen I want, is it? Hang on one second. There we go. Okay. Okay. So here's Daniel Barenboim. Okay.
The conductor is rather expressive.
He's, extremely expressive, almost cartoonishly expressive.
Yeah.
In fact, when I was watching it the first time, I was sort of reminded of some of those old, like, Looney Tunes cartoons where they would, you'd have, like, Bugs Bunny, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck conducting Wagner, every ridiculous, physical pratfall that they could stage, they just threw it in.
What he's doing in the palm of his hand.
Yeah.
What's going on?
Yeah, at one point he sort of, he almost like curls down, and he's making this minute little gesture. Like, who's watching that? Who can even see what he's doing?
I know.
I was going to ask Kim and Mary, when you play in front of different conductors, how do you know what they mean?
That's exactly what I asked her last week, because I was clueless. I mean, all these signals that he's giving seem to me completely random. And one of the things that Kim noted is that he's not doing the thing that usually is thought of as kind of the basic task of conducting. You provide a visual pulse for the orchestra to go on, right? He's actually not doing very much of that. He's kind of letting the orchestra handle the rhythm on its own. He does, probably they're sophisticated enough that they don't really need to see that visual pulse. But that kind of leaves him free to sort of make whatever gesture he likes. And so I was sort of wondering how many of these are actually meaningful signals? How many of these are conventional signs that a conductor gives to the orchestra? And how many of them are just him basically dancing on stage?
Well, Kim, tell us.
Or Mary, both of you.
Yeah, you want to say something, Mary, about that?
Did you hear the question?
The conducting, I was just wondering, how many of those strange gestures that he's making are really meaningful signals to the orchestra?
Oh, very much.
100%. Okay. Well, this is where my musical literacy comes in. I've never played in an orchestra, so I'm one of those guys that tends to be kind of cynically skeptical towards the conductor. Look at him, like, he's not playing an instrument, he's just waving his hands. Do we really need him there? Is he really doing something? That's a very, I know that's a vulgar Philistine attitude.
Very mature and well-educated orchestra.
Yes. To be able to do what he's doing, you have to be able to lean on an ensemble that really knows what they're doing.
Which orchestra was this?
I'm not sure. I've just clicked it off.
Was it the BBC?
Okay, yeah.
Wasn't he the conductor of the London Symphony for a long time?
I believe so.
He's very unique.
He was also in Chicago for a while too.
He's married to, I forget.
Jacqueline Dupre was named.
Yes, Jacqueline Dupre was his wife.
Yes, that's right.
And she died of MS a long time ago.
So what is it? Does he have a home orchestra that he conducts the most at?
At one point I think he did, but I
not
think
anymore.
now
I think he's retired now, but he was in Israel for a while with the Israeli Philharmonic, with Chicago, with London, I believe.
He's been around a long time.
He's been around a long time. Yeah. If you look at, like, there's an old with his wife, Jacqueline Dupre, and Itzhak Perlman and Pinka Superman.
They're
There's
relatives,
a whole.
aren't they?
Barenboim and Dupre were married, and no, I don't think
He's not related to
Superman.
Perlman, I thought.
No. There's a Trout Quintet video or recording that they did together. That's really interesting. But that was from, like, I want to say 1976.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, he's been around
50 years.
Very, very long time. But yeah, I think a lot of the gestures that he's making are necessary. And very small things, like when he takes the stick and does that, he is setting the tempo there. And the only people that come in at that moment are the strings. And so he is showing the strings, this is what your tempo is going to be. But when the rest of the orchestra picks up on that tempo, then they know. The trumpet section doesn't need to see that. They need to hear the violins going, ba-dum-ba-da-ya-da-ba.
But then we find him at other moments sort of moving in a way that doesn't seem, like at one point he does this kind of
And
thing with his body. Yeah, and winks to the audience. Well, I'm not sure if he's winking to one of the players.
I think it's the bassoonist.
Okay, might be the bassoonist. and then there's that one really weird moment where he sticks his hands like this and goes.
Yeah.
Just like, I've never seen a conductor do that before. Is that okay? So
That
that's
was
not
a
a
little
conventional
weird.
signal. That's him kind of improvising, and that I think is something that the symphony kind of induces. There's something about the way this symphony concludes, where it's just kind of going off the rails, and Beethoven is giving us this compressed fireworks show, a kind of kitchen sink approach, where he's going to give us, all the most energetic and exciting features of that neoclassical period in music. All the stuff that most tickled the fancy of his patrons. It's all getting kind of shoved in to this final movement. And I want to suggest that the reason he's doing that is because he's giving a kind of farewell to that style. We know that his next symphony, Symphony Number 3, the Eroica Symphony, is going to be very different. It's going to be, in many respects, inaccessible. It was not very well received when it was first performed. Some people adored it. Some people thought it was completely incomprehensible. It was too demanding. The second movement, for instance, is a funeral dirge. What on earth is funeral music doing in a symphony? A symphony is supposed to be uplifting. It's supposed to, depict the harmony of a coherent society, that sort of thing. But Beethoven kind of disappoints those expectations with the Third Symphony. The Second Symphony is where he's kind of finally nailing the coffin shut on the old classical tradition. All the stuff that Mozart and Haydn and Boccherini were really celebrated for, he's giving us the best of that so that he can go beyond it. And I want to talk a little bit about why it is that he makes that transition, because I don't think...
I'd like
sure.
to ask. I don't know if it was just my mind was out of kilter or what. Was the orchestra seated differently? The cellos were on the conductor's left hand. And were the violas there?
I didn't know that.
I've never seen the violins being on the right side.
It was first violins, cellos, violas, and then second violins, where the cellos usually sit. So yes, we're not crazy.
I've never seen that done.
Phoenix Symphony actually sits that way.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that has been done. Yeah.
All right. Well, I was thinking, why see?
Hang on one second, I just need to reload my...
It's so rare that we see the conductor from the front.
Yeah.
There was a series of video things that I saw, like they do the opera in big theaters. Mm-hmm. This was a series that I saw a couple of years ago, much more than but it's so rare that to see what the conductor does, and I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. The concert hall in Maryland that the Baltimore Symphony plays in, and also the National Philharmonic, has seats that are behind the stage, and so some audience members choose to sit up there, probably for that reason, so they can see the conductor.
In the series,
I wonder what the sound is like there.
Oh, the sound is amazing. That hall is, I don't know. It's just, the acoustics are so good in that hall. Do you remember it?
Where is it?
Strathmore, out in Maryland.
Oh, yeah.
It's a gorgeous hall.
That's a really beautiful space.
Yeah.
So, the portrait I've got on display here, this is Prince Lichnowsky. This was one of Beethoven's patrons in the early part of his career. He is the man to whom Symphony Number 2 was dedicated. And he actually dedicated 7 different works to the prince, so he exercised an enormous influence over Beethoven's career. But the most famous story regarding their relationship concerns how it broke up. This is probably my single favorite quote from any musician ever. This is a letter that Beethoven wrote to Prince Lichnowsky in 1806, basically ending the patronage, in which he said, "Prince, what you are through chance and birth. What I am through my own labor. There are many princes, and there will continue to be thousands more, but there is only one." You just have to love that. There's something just really exciting. There are so many guys I would love to say that to, but can't. And he must have felt good to write this letter. And I think that this was a letter that Beethoven was waiting to write for at least a decade. I think that this resentment was brewing in him, and there are good historical reasons for saying that, because Prince Lichnowsky, it turns out, had involvements that haven't always been thoroughly recognized. It was discovered about 30 years ago that in the year 1791, before his association with Beethoven, Prince Lichnowsky filed a lawsuit against another composer for unpaid debts, and he ended up winning that lawsuit. Lichnowsky was awarded 1,400 florins from this composer. The composer's name, you might be familiar with him, was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. This, of course, occurs within, the award came within a few months of Mozart's death. So you can very literally think of Prince Lichnowsky as contributing to the impoverishment that led to Mozart dying of a completely curable disease in a state of complete misery at the age of, I believe, 34? Something like that, yeah. And I don't know if Beethoven was aware of the lawsuit, but since he spent quite a lot of time with the prince, he must have been aware that he had an association with Mozart. He must have been aware that he had formerly been a patron of his. He probably had at least some suspicion of how Lichnowsky had treated him. And I think that this gives us an interesting insight into the meaning of what Beethoven says here, because there's something more going on here than just a denunciation of a man that Beethoven resented personally. I think his language is worth paying attention to. Prince, you are through chance and birth. What I am through my own labor. That little word labor, I think, is worth focusing on. There are a lot of words that Beethoven might have used in its place. He might have said something like, what I am through my own genius. Or what I am through my own character. Or what I am through my native talent. But instead, he chose to focus on labor. And so he specifically puts labor in opposition to chance and birth, which means that there's a specifically political dimension to the tension here. Beethoven is identifying with those who labor, those who work. He really, really seriously understands himself as a member of the working class. And he understands that that working class is entirely subject to a class of people like Prince Lichnowsky, who do no work but control all the means of production. Beethoven is acutely aware that for generations, musicians and composers have been required to compose the music that their wealthy patrons desired, to compose according to their tastes, to compose music that would somehow affirm their place in the world, that would that would give comfort to their dominance. And this is something that I think Beethoven increasingly bristled against. And because Beethoven, we know, identified very, very firmly with Mozart. In fact, this was something not even just Beethoven. His own parents had basically designated him to be the next Mozart. He was brought up with the idea that you are the prodigy that is going to continue that legacy. You will fulfill what Mozart did not live to complete. And so at every stage of his career, Beethoven understands himself as part of the Mozart school, part of the legacy of Mozart. And to know that his own patron was at least partially responsible for Mozart's death and ignominy, that's enough to fire up anybody's revolutionary political impulses. There's even more to it than that, though. And I think that what Beethoven was thinking of was far more than just a personal resentment against a prince that had harmed somebody he admired. I think these political designations show that Beethoven understood himself really to be a part of a real political revolution that was taking place during his own lifetime. And
how old was Beethoven then?
In 1806, Beethoven,
When was he born?
You know what? Yeah, you're going to have to look it up. He would have been around 30.
Around is good.
Yeah, he wasn't a child anymore.
Were there percussions from him?
I'm sorry?
Repercussions.
Repercussions.
Oh yes, immediate repercussions. In fact, the occasion for the letter was that Prince Lichnowsky had invited some French officers over to his estate and had ordered Beethoven to provide musical entertainment for the occasion. Now, inviting French officers to be entertained is obviously a political act. I mean, that would be almost the equivalent of, I don't know, Donald Trump inviting, members of the Saudi royal family to be entertained at the White House, which I suppose probably has been done. But it's something that's likely to really upset a lot of people, to feel that political responsibilities are being neglected there. Remember that this is the period when France is trying to conquer all of Europe. Napoleon is going around with his army trying to build an empire that will basically cover the entire territory of mainland Europe. And Beethoven's Third Symphony will be a kind of statement in response to this. But Beethoven's not just thinking of, the political and economic and military repression. He's also thinking about the way these political forces shape music, the way it determines what kind of music can and will be heard in public, what kind of music, who it is that music is supposed to please, what kind of tastes it's supposed to satisfy. And to get a better picture of the kinds of musical tastes that dominated at the time, I think the best place to look is actually to the architecture. If we look at the kinds of music forms, the locations in which classical music was being performed, we get an interesting picture of how these people supposed music was supposed to work, how they thought, what they thought it was actually for, what kind of social functions it fulfills. So this is kind of almost at random. This is just a picture of one of the major opera houses in France in the middle of the 18th century. Just look at it for a second. I just kind of let it maybe give you a few impressions. But if you had nothing but this to go on, if this was your only source of knowledge for what music was like in the 18th century, what might you say about it? Wealth. Good. There is, it's almost aggressive showiness, an ostentation. They're putting enormous material resources on public display. I've often thought that this is probably the most decadent period in all of architecture, the Rococo period, where you get these incredibly ornate displays of meticulous detail, everything covered in, leaved gold and things like that. And it's all, it emerges as just almost too much wealth to even be pleasant to look at. But one of the things that I noticed is just the layout of the theater itself. I mean, we're facing the stage here, right? So it's sort of the center and focal point of our perspective, but look at actually how the audience is arranged. We don't get to actually look at the back of the theater because we're kind of that's where we're sort of seated right now. But notice how all along it's almost like a circle or a sort of horseshoe shape going on. And the way that the actual spectators are seated, they have to actually, especially the ones that are seated in the balconies, the expensive seats, they have to turn their heads to look at the stage. Right?
What about the people way up there?
Yeah. You also have these people way up at the top. I think this stuff is just sculptures. I don't think that's actually spectators.
The orchestra is not on stage.
The orchestra's not on stage. They're kind of hidden down at the bottom there. But if you're seated at a place like this, right?
It's difficult to see.
It's really kind of hard to see the stage in a way. It's not ideal.
But everybody can see them in there as well.
Good. It's very easy to see the rest of the audience. And it's even easier if you're seated way up here to be seen.
And you have
by
the binoculars.
And that, I would argue, is really what classical music was about in the 18th century. It wasn't really about going and listening to the brilliant inventions of a genius composer. It was about using whatever that composer had come up with as the backdrop for you to display your wealth and vanity, to show off your jewelry and your 6-foot powdered wig and your expensive ball gowns and what have you. And the music, in that respect, becomes kind of incidental. It's really just there for ambiance. It's just there to kind of give you something to ignore while you spend your time focusing on how lovely you look and how your petty envies, and you can gossip in between the arias and do all that sort of thing. But the music is really just there to give an occasion for people to show up and socialize in the kind of vain manner that your typical 18th century nobleman would have done. And this directly shapes the way music gets made. I mean, opera in the 18th century is structured specifically to accommodate that vanity. It's basically built as a series of recitatives, the dialogue section, punctuated by little arias and choruses, where the idea is that you wake up and pay attention to the arias and the choruses, and then when you go back to the recitatives, you can go back to gossiping and looking around at the crowd and not really paying much attention. But nobody's very invested in the opera as a whole. It's there just as a pretext to allow folks to see and be seen, and to indulge in these really almost nauseating displays of wealth. Or at least that's how I find them. I can't speak for everybody's taste, but I find there's something really gaudy about this architecture. I think that's how Beethoven found it. In fact, he's not the only one. Many composers declared that this whole notion of how public music is supposed to work it needs to be done away with. This is what induced Wagner actually to build his own opera house, the Festspielhaus at Bayreuth, because he wanted a different design. He wanted something where everybody is glued to the stage. Everybody is looking at what the performers are doing. It's all about the music. It's not about the egoism of the wealthy audience members. And this is something that I think really got under Beethoven's skin. This is why he wanted a new kind of music, and he knew that it really couldn't be achieved unless it was something founded upon a new kind of society. He knew that in order to restructure music, society itself needed to be restructured. And that was really going on at a very rapid pace during Beethoven's career. As we mentioned, Beethoven, his career begins right in the middle of the French Revolution. And I think it's worth maybe just summarizing briefly what that revolution was all about, because I think, at least, I might be presuming too much here, but I know for most people who were educated in my generation, the French Revolution is kind of a non-event. We weren't really taught very much about it. It was only after high school, even after college really, that I began to really appreciate how much took place during this period. If I had to trace it back to a specific and instigating cause, it seems to me that the French Revolution, more than anything, resulted from the 7 Years' War, the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, which is better known in most American history textbooks as the French and Indian War. You're probably familiar with that. The French and Indian War was really a kind of small theater of this much larger conflict, the 7 Years' War that took place between France and Britain. It was a kind of competition over the spread of these two competing empires. And as we know, the French lost the conflict, and they lost bad. When it was over, the French government was saddled with an enormous war debt that they were really kind of baffled on how they were ever going to repay. And as you know, the only real means of reducing a national debt is to raise tax revenue. So that was the French government's response. The king begins instituting new taxes. Now this created a much, much bigger problem, because if you know anything about 18th century French history, you know that the French tax code was insanely complicated, ridiculously complicated. There were taxes, every year for centuries they had been adding new and strange taxes to try and support the conspicuous wealth of the ruling class. And the real problem was that these taxes did not fall evenly over all the members of French society. French society was officially divided up into 3 distinct classes, or estates. There was the class of the noblemen, the counts, the dukes, the princes, the people with titles, and so forth. The royalty of France, of which the king, of course, was the head. And then on sort of the second tier, you had the clergy, the church, the priests, the people that ran the religious institutions throughout France. And then beneath them you had the third estate, which was basically the working class, the people that actually, built things and grew the food and did all the stuff that actually needed to be done. And it was the third estate that basically shouldered the entire tax burden. So they didn't get to enjoy any of the benefits of that warfare, but they had to foot the entire bill. And they became increasingly unhappy about this. After the 7 Years' War, we see throughout France all of these small-scale uprisings of working-class people, often led by small business owners. And one of the real problems was that the third estate, this working class, was no longer a single class. It constituted well over 90% of the French population, and it itself was divided between the poorer kind of wage laborers and the people that had formerly been thought of as French peasants, and this smaller subset of basically capitalists, business owners, what the French began to call the bourgeoisie, people who made their living either through trade or through banking, which was becoming a very, very big industry at this time. They had kind of risen up from that working class to begin to accumulate fortunes of their own. And they had done so very, very quickly. Often they outpaced the nobles. In fact, by the end of the 18th century, you saw French noblemen borrowing heavily from the bourgeoisie because they were the ones that were making all of the money. The French noblemen had forgotten how. They really didn't know how to increase their wealth except by multiplying all of these taxes. So when Louis XVI comes to the throne and finds that his country is plunged into this enormous debt crisis, he does a couple of things that probably weren't the best idea. One, he lets his wife Marie Antoinette buy a $3 million diamond necklace. That didn't go over too well with the public. Two, he builds a new palace for himself at Versailles. That's another probably very, very bad idea. That all by itself made him the most hated monarch probably in all of the world. And three, he decides to invite some financial experts from other countries to come in and try and restructure the French national debt. So for about 2 decades, we get all of these weird sort of experiments trying to figure out some way to reduce the national debt. None of them work. They all fail miserably, and the French populace becomes more and more angry as this debt burden becomes more and more unbearable. More and more of them are starving. There are famines popping up throughout the country. And finally, in 1789, everything explodes. We get the most famous and dramatic incident of the entire revolution on July 14th, 1789, the storming of the Bastille. So you probably see images of this event. The Bastille is this gigantic, very imposing prison and armory located right in the middle of Paris. And the people of Paris, who were tired of starving while the nobles did nothing, decided to go in and take power. They took control of the armory. There were only a few prisoners inside, but they did set most of them free, and they began preparing to go literally to war against the nobles. And from then on out, the revolution begins to become more and more violent. So by the time Beethoven's career begins in the 1790s, France is in the middle of the period that we know as the Reign of Terror. The revolutionary class has taken control, and it's gone about purging the entire French population of anybody who's sympathetic to the old order, the monarchy, anybody that would seek to restore the monarchy. So this is what Beethoven is contending with and trying to, in some ways, aid and represent in his own career. So I'm going to try and skip over a few pieces here because I don't think we have time to go into too much detail about it. But I will go ahead and give us a little bit of Shostakovich because, in a sense, what we get at about the midpoint of Beethoven's career is something very similar to what we find in the middle of Dmitri Shostakovich's career. This is a picture that was taken of Shostakovich in the year 1950, and every single photograph that I've ever seen of this composer, he has exactly the same expression on his face.
He's very bothered.
He always looks really, really terrified. He's always got a furrowed brow, his eyes are always kind of squinty, you can see the tension in his lips, he's even fiddling with his fingers down here. I think Shostakovich essentially lived out his career in a state of almost constant terror. because the same revolutionary forces that had taken control, the same kind of revolutionary forces that had taken control of France during Beethoven's life, and had instituted these purges where everybody unfriendly to the revolution gets the guillotine. Exactly the same thing was going on in Russia after the death of Lenin, when Stalin takes control of the government. He institutes policies that aren't just political. He institutes specific prescriptions about what kind of art and literature and music the Soviet Union can and should promote. Now, for a while, Shostakovich enjoyed a good deal of favor under this administration. His works were seen as very fresh and lively. They were very innovative. Russia was definitely in the market for some new and exciting composers, because almost all of its most famous composers had been conservatives. They had been people like Stravinsky, who was basically a fascist and hated the Russian Revolution very, very vocally. But Shostakovich was, he never made those kinds of statements. He seemed to be the kind of composer that the Russian government could use for propagandistic purposes. That was until 1934, when Shostakovich's most famous opera was produced. Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk is the title. I can barely pronounce that title. And it was extremely popular. It was a big hit right from the beginning, until Stalin himself attended a performance of the opera in 1936. And this was a major event. In fact, I dare say this is probably what Shostakovich looked like while he was sitting in the audience at that performance. Because Stalin, it is said, was very visibly displeased by what he heard. He did not like the music. He didn't like the plot of the opera. He thought the libretto was quite decadent. He thought the music was far too experimental and avant-garde. He couldn't connect with the people. It was egotistical. He just hated it. And he actually walked out during the middle of the third act. Now, if you know anything about Stalin, you know that if you've gotten on his bad side, you're in trouble. The purges had already been taking place at this point. Thousands of people, high-ranking officials, had been put to death by the Stalinist administration. And Shostakovich was very, very scared that he was the next in line. He even knew he had composer friends who had been either sent to Siberia or died in prison. Some of them had died under arrest for not writing the kind of music that the government preferred. And what was even worse is that shortly after the performance, an article was published in the government newspaper, Pravda, with the title "Muddle Instead of Music." It was a review of Shostakovich's opera, and this is what it had to say. From the first minute, the listener is shocked by deliberate dissonance, by a confused stream of sound. Snatches of melody, the beginnings of a musical phrase are drowned, emerge again, and disappear in a grinding and squealing roar. To follow this music is most difficult. To remember it, impossible. Here we have leftist confusion instead of natural human music. The power of good music to infect the masses has been sacrificed to a petty bourgeois formalist attempt to create originality through cheap clowning. It is a game of clever ingenuity that may end very badly. Now, what made this so difficult for Shostakovich to read was, in addition to that incredibly threatening final sentence, the rumor went around that the author of this article was none other than Joseph Stalin himself. Now, that probably wasn't true. He probably didn't write the article himself, but he may well have ordered it to be written, and we know that it definitely expressed what he thought of Shostakovich's music at that time. But the idea that it may end very badly, I mean, that sounds almost like your next work better be different, or you can expect the gulag or the guillotine or something along those lines. I find the language of this passage really, really interesting for a number of reasons. For one, his use of the word infect, the power of good music to infect the masses, has been sacrificed to a petty bourgeois formalist attempt. Notice that he uses the word infect in a very positive sense. He thinks that music is supposed to infect the masses. That's what Stalin believed, that it was supposed to have this kind of infectious quality. That's a very strange metaphor to use to describe good music, to think of it as working the way a disease works. I'm not sure I can make a great deal of sense out of that. But I'd like to kind of put it to the test, if we could, just by hearing a brief sample of Shostakovich's later work, the Cello Concerto, which is the one that we will be listening to. Where did there it goes. The Cello Concerto is different. It's a later work. It was written in 1959, about 6 years after Stalin died, probably executed, or probably assassinated by one of his own men. And this particular passage, as you can see, is really right in the middle. I want you to sort of think of the objections that the Stalinist article made to Shostakovich's music. Tell me what you think. How does this sound bear that out? So this, it strikes me that if we were to sort of, take this sort of piece as a response to the objections that Stalin had made in his remarks, it sounded almost as though Shostakovich is aggressively breaking every single rule that Stalin has laid down. He's making it as inaccessible as he possibly can. And the changefulness of this passage, I think, is absolutely astonishing. I mean, it's like it feels at times almost as though he's shifting styles, like every other measure. You get two measures that sound fairly neoclassical, and then suddenly we're in atonal territory, and then 2 measures later we're somewhere else. Is very, very jerky, like this constant moving in and out of almost discrete genres. And this sort of thing happens really throughout the cello concerto itself. And this is something that I would, I guess, invite you to consider as you listen to all 3 of these pieces, because they've all taken a very interesting, they seem to me, they've all made an interesting statement about the relationship between the kinds of music that the ruling class wants and the kind of music that could be actually accessible to an audience. Stalin's ideal variety would have been, I think, something like Bizet's Carmen. You get an opera where the songs are compulsively singable. They stick in your head. Everything is memorable. Everything is kind of folksy. You can whistle the tunes, that kind of thing. Shostakovich is making it very, very hard to do that. There are melodies here, but they're not the kind of melodies that you're going to be humming to yourself as you walk out of the concert hall. They're more demanding than that. They don't make themselves available just to the first listener. But I would invite you to, again, consider how this kind of demand for a music that presents particular political values has shaped these three pieces. I'll end with there because I'm definitely out of time. But before I go, are there any questions or final comments?
Well, what the article said is essentially true. That, describing the music.
Yes.
It's just the interpretation that is.
Yeah. In purely descriptive terms, he actually sounds kind of accurate. He's exactly talking about the same piece, but he's definitely caught something of Shostakovich's style, the characteristics that we see recurring in his music. The question isn't so much did Stalin get it right, as is that aesthetic ideal really worth hanging on to? Is that actually the kind of music that we want? And who should decide what kind of music we should want?
Well, it's interesting to hear the parallels about the time that they were both writing their music.
Yeah.
I find that very fascinating.
Yeah, I'm sorry I wasn't able to go into more detail about that. We could explore them a lot further because it was I think these two men had a lot in common. I think that their disappointments in many ways paralleled one another. Beethoven, I think, in the beginning of the revolution, I think he was very deeply optimistic about the changes that were taking place. I think he looked forward to having this old, decadent, noble class supplanted by this much more dynamic class of bourgeois business people. Those that were really looking to reshape society. But I don't think it took him very long to figure out that what was coming to power wasn't quite the dynamic force that he had thought. When Napoleon first became a name, Beethoven idolized him. But by the time Napoleon declares himself to be emperor, Beethoven has come to realize that this guy has not been going around Europe liberating all of these oppressed peoples. What he's been doing is dethroning a bunch of decadent princes and dukes and installing his own crony businessmen, friends, and useless family members in those offices so that he can build a European empire of his own. He ends up installing his own brother as the king of Spain. It's not exactly a democratic gesture. It's not something you do when you're trying to liberate a country. You don't go around making new kings. And once Beethoven figured that out, I think he became very, very skeptical of the revolution. He felt that some of its principles had been betrayed. I wanted to go even further and try and make the parallel with a third historical figure, Karl Marx, because I think Marx had a similar attitude. He too was very optimistic about what the revolution had began as and became very, very deeply disappointed by what it turned into as he observed the cynicism of the ruling class the new ruling class that was coming to power. Unfortunately, we can't really develop that in much detail right now, but just something to think about, that all of these works are very, very deeply bound up with the political movements that were going on at their time. I don't think we can understand them in isolation from that context.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very interesting.
Michael Doherty was from Cedar Rapids, Iowa.
Oh.
So, and then he went to school at University of North Texas, and then he went to New York City. So I don't think it's the Ann Arbor connection.
Okay, it isn't who I was thinking
Yeah.
of then.
And he didn't live in L.A.
No, not that I gathered from the little article I found. No.
That's it.
I
You
live
know, because the DSO was doing a lot of new music for a number of years, and it was really kind of fascinating. And then Plymouth had their own Plymouth Symphony, and so that they
I've
were
been
doing
reading
some
about
experimental
the
music
revolution.
out of
French
I mean, you know, because
Collins.
it was just
Oh,
kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
Without.
So I'm glad that they're going to have that kind of music with the
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so
I mean, the
too. Should be fun.
difference, yeah, the three different ones.
They're all very different, for sure.
The French Revolution itself was such a big event. The American Revolution was not as
Interesting.
Well, I don't think the French tried to create all things like patience, sponge,
so it affected nations far beyond France itself. The French Revolution was a revolution that erupted from France to its rapid by the end of it. I mean, the old order was devastated. It was the end of monarchy.
Now, are you part of the orchestra or part of that?
No, I'm in the orchestra.
So much of this will be very personal.
Oh, yes.
Right.
Now, when
Beethoven or
No, I wasn't.
Doherty number.
You went to Hawaii.
The land of milk and honey.
That sounds like fun.
That's pretty cool.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, it might even be more interesting to do a lecture after. Because then, everybody's got to hear, everybody's got the same impressions.
Right, like, okay, if you're gonna play that, it sounds like that was gonna happen.
Yeah.
In Shostakovich, that might be it.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, like how you'll,
Maybe even more of a discussion.
Actually, I used to play with the orchestra back in 1989 and 90 when I was in high school.
Yeah.
And then I left.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, if you go having heard a lecture, it's almost like going to a home with the same.
The first couple of years, things just had me interested. I was just
It might be more fun to do a lecture.
I know, because I know James.
I was gonna say, you know, Jeeves really has to write down, yeah.
full time, I guess, the other year. Yeah.
Baby shower, because I was leaving the president.
What's the next event?
I can't work anymore during maternity.
That's a really good idea.
That's right.
Yeah, it is amazing how,
But it seems like,
you know, how it
Yeah.
comes
Oh, like,
out.
Things with the bow,
Psychological.
so no one would look at the belly now,
They wear
of course, I look like I'm
Yeah.
No, but, yeah, so she's not.
What does it mean?
Indian,
And of course,
Russian,
it would be-
what seems like
Yes.
Oh,
As it should be.
But I was so surprised with the,
So then when I saw the
Maybe
orchestra,
six.
me too, was
Yeah.
confusing, yeah.
I've never seen that, and
he
it must
told
be
me
the
when was-
conductor's
this
choice,
is what,
of
Yeah.
course.
Saturday,
But you know, you take all the violins being the opposite side. My heavens, I always thought they were seated.
She actually had the flute.
Because
A lot of people had, like,
But
you
it's-
know,
Yeah.
That's what they were.
Yeah.
You think,
but it
who's
lasts.
hearing what they're
What's
saying?
needed.
Yeah.
He still has a little friend.
Well, I always,
From the
by
audience.
the time I was a kid,
Yeah.
we done chemical, and
But
I
now
go,
I've seen that
and
it
it would
didn't
last
show
2 or
it.
3 weeks.
I think that's
Yeah,
what.
I've never had
They
it.
were seen by
Yeah.
over, like.
But this time
But it
everybody
was
was
just
having.
the strangest thing you heard reversed.
Yeah.
Okay, I think
The sun is coming out.
Well, it's almost spring, that's exactly what I was.
And we don't even, in the orchestra thing.
We stopped at Michael's and then after beyond, And I saw
Wow.
all the summer furniture and
Oh,
furniture
yeah.
set back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everywhere sort of.
Yeah,
It's
summer
treasure
furniture,
and
oh,
all
that's
the
wonderful.
baton.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, all right.
So this would be like looking out.
Say hello.
Yeah.
Thank you
Oh,
so
thank
much.
you.
And we'll pursue our idea.
Yeah, I'm gonna
A postscript.
that would be a good, I think I would like that even more. I think that's a good idea.
Fascinating.